Our speaker today. Her name is Dr. Melissa Edmondson McCullough. She specializes in 19th and early 20th century British women writers with a particular interest in women's supernatural fiction. She is the editor of a critical edition of Alice Perrin's East of Suez, published by Victorian Secrets in 2011, and author of Women's Ghost Literature in 19th Century Britain, published in 2013, and Women's Colonial Gothic Writing, 1850 to 1930, Haunted Empire, published in 2018. She's also edited Avenging Angels, Ghost Stories by Victorian Women Writers, published in 2018. And 2 volumes for Handheld Press, Women's Weird, Strange Stories by Women, 1890 to 1940, and Women's Weird 2, More Strange Stories by Women, 1891 to 1937, and that was just published this year. So she is very busy with her writing and editing, and we are thrilled that she took a few minutes out of her day to join us on a Friday afternoon to tell us more about her work. And as a reminder, the title of her talk today is Between the Wars, Between the Covers, Women's Interwar Ghost Stories of the 1920s and 1930s. So Melissa, we are going to hand it over to you.
Okay,
and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Okay, so let me go ahead and do my screen share here. Open that up. Okay, so let me go switch over to presentation. Let's see if this works. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. So I'm going to start out actually with a bonus slide as a kind of welcome to the special Halloween edition of Cocktails with a Curator. So my theme cocktail goes perfectly, I think, with my talk today on women writers because it was actually invented by a woman. So the Hanky Panky, which I have here in my little plastic cup because I'm not in my house, was invented by famed bartender Ada Coleman, and you can see her here. And she was known as Coley. And she was promoted to head bartender at the American Bar at the Savoy Hotel. And she kept that position for 23 years and was only one of 2 women to actually hold that position. So Coley was quite ahead of her time, and she was known as being sort of an early mixologist, and she really enjoyed creating these cocktails. So one day, this cocktail has a kind of neat backstory to it. So one day, the comedic actor Charles Hawtrey came into the hotel and said, "Coley, I am tired. Give me something with a bit of punch to it." And she recalls it was for him that I spent hours experimenting until I had invented a new cocktail. The next time he came in, I told him I had a new drink for him. He sipped it, and draining the glass, he said, "By Jove, this is the real Hanky Panky." And the name Hanky Panky stuck. And in Britain, it means magic or witchcraft. So I thought, okay, this is perfect. So I have a cocktail invented by a woman for women writers, and I have a cocktail that's named after magic and witchcraft, which I'll be talking about a little bit in the talk. So for today's talk, I'd like to focus on women's supernatural fiction of the 1920s and 1930s. And I wanted to go beyond the usual Victorian era ghost stories. You know, most of us probably associate with people like Charles Dickens or Sheridan Le Fanu, Bram Stoker's Dracula, you know, people like that, maybe Robert Louis Stevenson's, you know, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So while women really did fully participate in the ghost story tradition in the Victorian period, and their work really sold as well, oftentimes better than male writers, their contributions to the genre after kind of the turn of the 20th century into the 20th century is not quite as well known. So that's what I wanted to focus on today for the talk. So moving on here, I wanted to kind of give you an idea, just kind of a small, you know, snapshot here of just a very small group of women who were publishing supernatural fiction in the 1920s and 1930s. And again, this is a very, very small percentage. that we're publishing during this time. So some of these, might be familiar to you. If I can kind of, hopefully you can see my little pointer here. Stella Gibbons for Cold Comfort Farm. You might have read that at some point. Edith Wharton was well known for her novels. I think the people I can see, I'm seeing some head shaking there. A couple others, let me see who might be. Leonora Carrington, who was known for her surrealist art, also published short stories. So she might be a little bit more well known to you. But basically, you probably know these women, if you know them at all, through their novels and not their short stories. So that's what I wanted to focus on a little bit more today, was short fiction by two that I think maybe, I know one, maybe the other one will be probably new to you. So as the reality of a 20-minute talk started to sink in, and keeping in mind all those squares in the last slide, I decided to focus today on two prominent writers out of that much, much larger group. So I'm calling it A Tale of Two Marjories, Marjorie Lawrence and Marjorie Bowen. And through these women, I wanted to show you today how their work was sort of first published in the 1920s, 1930s, and then how it was republished and sort of reinvented and remarketed in the following decades. So I'm kind of going a little bit beyond the 20s and 30s too, towards the end of the talk. So the first writer that I wanted to focus on today is Marjorie Lawrence. She was born in 1889 and lived until 1969. So she really, those life and death, dates, she really experiences all the great and terrible events in the first half of the 20th century. She lives through, both world wars. And lives quite long. So she was born in Wolverhampton, England, and in her early years she pursued a career in visual art. So she started out in a visual artist, and I'm going to connect that to her published work in just a second. She lived in Chelsea, London, as definitely a bohemian type art student, and she actually wrote a novel based on her time as a Chelsea art student. And that novel, Bohemian Glass, was actually the publishers, people tried to ban that book because it was rather scandalous. But her most well-known collections are her supernatural fiction. So we have Knights of the Round Table, 1926. That was her first collection, and we're going to be looking at these in just a second. The Terraces of Night, 1932, and The Floating Cafe in 1936. And what's also interesting about Marjorie is that she was a self-professed ghost hunter, so one of kind of the earliest ghost hunters that we have. And she was also a lifelong believer in spiritualism, which is the belief that there is life after death and that the dead can sort of return to the living and communicate through seances and spirit mediums and things like that. So she published a good number of her novels were based on her belief in spiritualism. And she also talked a little bit about that in a nonfiction work. It was not quite an autobiography, but sort of a memoir of her experiences contacting the dead in Ferry over Jordan, and that was published in 1944. So this is the first, hopefully you can see this pretty well. This is the dust jacket to Marjorie Lawrence's first published collection of supernatural fiction, Knights of the Round Table. It was published by Hutchinson, London, and it's structured around, as you might get from the title, it's structured around that kind of typical tradition that again comes from the Victorian period of ghost stories told around the fire. So again, very much in the time of Charles Dickens and things like that, you would have those stories. Particularly, interestingly enough, not really around Halloween, but Christmas time is more the time for telling ghost stories. So a little extra there. So the host in this collection is named Laurie, after Marjorie Lawrence. And what's kind of neat about this collection as well, and if you can see it here, right here in kind of this black background, the lower left corner, it says MH for Marjorie Harriet Lawrence. So again, what I said a couple of minutes ago, that artistic background she brought into her published work. So she actually created the cover, and you can't say that about a lot of authors. So I think that's sort of neat to see there. And then a couple other of her titles. We have The Terraces of Night, and this was the 1932. It was sort of a sequel to Knights of the Round Table. Once again, you had people, you know, sort of structured in that framework of each person tells their own ghost story. And they're just sort of, you know, hanging out together, having, you know, drinks and things like that. And then her third collection, published by Gerald's in 1936. And this, if you can kind of see and think about, let me go back to that one, and you can look at the Floating Cafe. This is also done by Marjorie Lawrence herself, and you can see it's very much of her style, although her name is not actually on this particular cover. So she was actually interested in designing her covers as well as writing the stories. So next, before I show you some more book covers, I'd like to talk a little bit more about how Lawrence's work was republished in the 1930s, 1940s by focusing on one particular series called the Reader's Library Publishing Company. So this series began in 1924 and was known for their very colorful and vibrant covers, and we'll look at a couple of examples of those in just a second. It was largely a paperback series, so copies were, of course, very affordable. But one of the downsides to this, and the reason, you know, why they were so affordable, is they're often, the pages themselves were published on very cheap, kind of wood pulpy paper. Very thin, you know, the type where you can kind of see the print, you know, on both sides bleeding through. So, you know, consequently, these books were very fragile. And, you know, kind of like today's, you know, maybe today's paperbacks or magazines, they were sort of meant to be read and then thrown away. So they really weren't meant to be saved. And, you know, again, consequently, because of that, they're quite rare today. There's not many that survive. So if we look at two examples here from my own collection, I was really fortunate to pick up both these copies at one time a few years ago. And we have Knights of the Round Table and The Terraces of Night. So we think back, you know, a couple of minutes ago to those original covers. They do look quite different. And you can pick up on the really vibrant, what I was talking about, the really vibrant colors here. My copy, this one here, I'm lucky to have it at all because it is very fragile. You can see there's quite a bit of like foxing and spotting on the cover. This one, The Terraces of Night, is actually in very, very good shape. But, you know, again, you can see kind of the marketing gimmicks that start to come in around this time as well. You know, someone who obviously maybe hadn't read the stories thought, hey, there's a round table in the title, so let's just put one on the cover. So there's a big round table on the cover. It really doesn't have anything to do with the story, just kind of a woman looking vaguely frightened. And then The Terraces of Night, I think, does a little bit better. This is actually based on one of the stories called The Mystery of the Crystal Snuff Box. And you can see the woman in the background here looking ghostly is the woman who comes back, and sort of not to give too much away, a young man comes to he buys this little crystal snuff box. You can see it on the table there at an antique store, and it has a lock of the woman's hair, and she turns out to be a witch, and trouble ensues. And then the woman in the foreground here is the man's fiance, so she sort of does a heroic thing towards the end. So those are some examples there of the popular kind of reimaginings of Lawrence's stories. So I'm going to transition to my next writer, but I want to get back a little bit later to some more Marjorie Lawrence covers we'll look at. So the next writer I'd like to focus on today is Marjorie Bowen. And this was the pseudonym, she had many pseudonyms, but this is the pseudonym of Margaret Gabrielle Vere Long, née Campbell. And Bowen was born on Hayling Island in Hampshire, England, and had quite a difficult time when she was growing up. Her father was an alcoholic and died young, leaving her mother to take care of the family. And kind of her mother was a little bit of a bohemian, and the family would travel around a lot. And this Marjorie really didn't like this. She wanted really a stable home, and she didn't get that when she was growing up. She studied at the Slade School of Fine Art and worked as a research assistant at the British Museum. And she published her first big bestseller, The Viper of Milan, in 1906. And a lot of her, she was also a historical novelist, and a lot of her work is set in the past. So this one in particular set in medieval Italy. And this was the one that really was the big break for Marjorie Bowen. This became an immediate bestseller, and it finally provided her with that financial security that she so desperately wanted, especially, you know, growing up, she didn't have that. So her supernatural novels, she wrote quite a few of these as well. So starting with Black Magic, A Tale of the Rise and Fall of Antichrist. A few years after, 1909, The Haunted Vintage, Julia Rosengrave, and The Fetch. And her supernatural fiction appears in The Last Bouquet. We'll take a look at that in a minute. 1933, The Bishop of Hell. These are just great titles. I love these titles. And Kexey's A Posthumous Collection that was assembled by the famed kind of house for Gothic publishing, Arkham House, in the late 1940s, and was published after her death a good number of years later, 1976. And her autobiography, it's a little bit difficult to find, but if you can find, I think there's maybe snippets of it online, but it's called The Debate Continues, and that was published in 1939. And a lot of people have said that her autobiography reads like a horror story because she does recount quite a lot that was happening early on in her life when, you know, before she sort of had that financial security. So I wanted to show us a couple of images here. The Bishop of Hell, I love, this is one of my favorite dust jackets, just because again, the vibrant, the colors here, you can see the bishop there, you know, burning in hell, and the flames are just really, really nicely done there. And then the other one, Black Magic, was her first supernatural novel that she wrote. Okay, so moving on to a couple of Bowen's short story collections. The first one we have is Dark Anne. And again, I really like this particular, it's very simple, but I like this particular dust jacket because it's sort of ominous. You have that building in the distance and like that cold, snowy weather. And it looks kind of dark, like there's not a lot of lights on. So like, what are you going to get to, you know, when you get up to this mysterious house? So this includes a few, not quite as many as Last Bouquet, which we'll get to in a minute, but it does include the ghost stories of Persistent Woman, The Accident, A Flower of Carnival, and Dark Anne. And then the next one is, I like this particular dust jacket too. This is The Last Bouquet, Some Twilight Tales. And this was published by John Lane in 1933. And this is the collection that includes the majority of Bowen's, really her best known ghost stories. So I wanted to include a few of those so you can see them there. And it's a little bit tricky with Bowen's work. Some of her work is still under copyright, but if you look around, you can find stories on the web. So I did want to list some of these for you. So if you want to kind of go back and maybe, you know, look at the recording and type some of these in, you can, it's pretty easy to find lots of these on the web. Okay, so now I'd like to transition and talk about some of the afterlives of these earlier works of Lawrence and Bowen by focusing on the Ace and Berkeley Gothics. And we can see here sort of what a typical cover for the Ace Gothics look like. They have a particular style. Okay, so Ace Books was founded in 1952 in New York City by Aaron A. Wynn. And the company initially published Westerns, some mysteries, and about a year later, they really got into science fiction, which became their best-selling genre. And after that, they focused on Gothic novels, movie tie-ins, romances, things like that. And Berkeley Books was established in 1955 by Charles Byrne and Frederick Klein, who had been working with the romance publisher Avon Books. And Berkeley was bought by G.P. Putnam Sons in 1965. So before I continue on, let me talk a little bit about this image here. So the book you see here is the first Ace book that was published, and it's Keith Vining's Too Hot for Hell. And this book was published with Samuel W. Taylor's The Grinning Gizmo, and it was published in the tête bêche style, which is French for head to toe. So if you see here, take a couple minutes to look a little bit closely at this. If you look at the top, you know, turn over book for second novel. So you could read the one and then you could just flip it and just flip it right over, and you could read. So you literally have 2 books in one book. So, you know, for 35 cents, that's pretty, you know, pretty good deal. But you can see kind of the lurid details here of how these books are being marketed as, you know, definitely popular light fiction for entertainment. Marijuana, music, and murder made him too hot for hell. So, you know, again, to pull you into that work. So that was one of their famous first ones. And then to give you another example here of kind of the brand of Ace Gothics, and it's kind of the subgenre is, you know, scantily clad women with fabulous hair running from mysterious houses. And that's what we get, right? For these, you can see how they hold up. There were hundreds of these published. So you can see again how, you know, they were very much of the same style. The one in the middle here, I'm assuming is a little bit smarter because she's wearing glasses, right? And then we have little teasers, you know, again, to pull you into these Gothic romances. So on this one, I'm not sure if you can see it, but I'll read it. She was a stranger in a strange land with no one to bid her welcome, but 2 people long dead. So again, you know, meant to pull you into this, you know, fun reading. And again, you can see the prices here. These were done in the 1960s, 95 cents, you know, 95 cents. So again, very, very affordable. Again, sort of meant to be read and thrown away a lot of the time. But there are definitely copies because so many of these hundreds were printed. You can find these, you know, fairly easily, and they're still fairly affordable. You can find copies for under $10 if you look around. Some of the rare ones, of course, are maybe a little bit more expensive. So I wanted to return to Marjorie Lawrence here and look at, again, I think it's really interesting to look at sort of the original and then see how it's reimagined when it's republished. So we have Bride of Darkness, and this was 1967. This is the first edition Dust Jacket, and it's hard to see down here at the bottom, but this is illustrated by Val Bureau. And it's one of my favorite Marjorie Lawrence dust jackets. It's this very nice stylized hummingbird. And not to give too much away, but the hummingbird makes an appearance, is very important to the plot near the end of the story. And then we have 1967. So again, we can tell by just looking at the reprintings how popular Marjorie Lawrence works were, because that same year we have Ace bringing out their version in a paperback. So this is hardcover with dust jacket, and then this one's paperback. And then again, we see kind of the same thing, you know, maybe not in a negligee, but kind of close to the same. We've got the teaser here. And then in 1972, we have Ace reissuing it again as Bride of Darkness with a little bit of a different look to it. And another thing I thought would be kind of fun to look at today is how, and again, you can see how they were, you know, able to be sold so cheap and how they were meant to be kind of produced very quickly. They didn't have any problem with just like reusing cover images. So this is Bride of Darkness, and then we have Memory of Macon over here. So, you know, all they had to do was, you know, use the same cover, change the title, change the author, make sure you change the teaser, but, you know, the image is exactly the same there. And then looking at some, again, Marjorie Bowen works and looking at how her work was sort of reimagined in the 1960s with these popular titles. We have her under her many, many pseudonyms. One interesting thing about Marjorie Bowen is that, like, for every different genre she would publish in, whether it was detective fiction or Gothic fiction or short stories, she had a different pseudonym to go along with it. So this one is Joseph Shearing. And you have, these are actually Berkeley Gothics. And you can see the Berkeley medallion here at the top. There it is there. And oops, there it is there. So again, you know, examples here. And we have her, it's sort of interesting too on this last one, and I know it's a little bit blurry, but we have her name, you know, Gabrielle Margaret Long, you know, writing under the name of, so I'm not really sure why you go to the trouble of, you know, having that one, you just write under your own name. But yeah, so we have those. And then one more quick example here. I have, just like I did for Marjorie Lawrence, I wanted to show us kind of the original and then how that particular work was reimagined in later decades. So this is actually the first American edition of The Strange Case of Lucille Clary. Harper Brothers did that. And then we have late 1940s. We have here the same story, and then we have the 1960s, again, reimagining. And we can also see how Berkeley took the formula of the Ace Gothics, right, of the woman kind of, fleeing from the mysterious house. And it had been so popular for Ace that they sort of reused it in their own books there. So you have that both being done by Ace and Berkeley. So just to wrap up, quickly, I'm a little bit over time right now. I wanted to sort of leave today, with maybe some suggestions for reading more if you'd like to read more about these two women and their works. So the first one I was able to find was a pretty good audio recording of Marjorie Bowen's novel Black Magic. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with LibriVox, but it's a nice free service. Some of the recordings are kind of hit and miss. Some are better than others. But it's a really good, I checked it to see, and it's a really good recording of her novel. So if you'd like to listen to it, you can listen to it there. So I have that. Hopefully you can go back and see the link for that. A couple of her recent republications, this was done by Wordsworth, Tales of Mystery and the Supernatural. This one is sadly, this whole series is sadly out of print now, but I included it today because if you look around, there are quite a few copies, secondhand copies, and they're really reasonably priced. So you can find copies of this one, and it's a really good collection. And then one that was done very recently based on one of her more well-known stories, The Crown Derby Plate, a ghost story actually here for Christmas. This was published very recently, so that one's fairly easy to find. And then Marjorie Lawrence is a little bit, I wanted to give you some places where you could find her work. Her work is still firmly under copyright, so there are not as many of her stories being republished today. But these are two that were done probably a good maybe 15 or so years ago now, maybe even longer than that, maybe more like 20. But her two first collections, Knights of the Round Table and the Terraces of Night, were reprinted. These were hardbound limited edition copies, so a little bit harder to track down, but it's well worth the effort. Marjorie Lawrence is one of my favorite writers, so if you can track these down, I would really recommend these two. And then in a shameless plug of self-promotion, I'm going to point you to my two collections that I've recently edited. And Women's Weird has a story by Marjorie Lawrence, The Haunted Saucepan. And Women's Weird 2 includes a story by Marjorie Bowen. So do check those out if you'd like to read more. So that does it for me today. So thank you very much. And let me turn off my share.
Thanks, Melissa. We do have some questions for you. And I think I don't think anybody will mind that we run over a few minutes. That was a very interesting presentation. So the first question, can you comment on the target audience for these two novelists, the two Marjories, and if the intended audience and the actual readers were perhaps different?
I think probably the intended audience, I would say early on, it was, men and women reading these collections. So when they were originally published in the 20s and 30s, they weren't, marketed towards any, one person. And she had a nice reading public, and it was very wide. I would say probably later on when you get to the, the Ace Gothics and the Gothic romances, those were probably, as romance is now, and I think it gets sort of a bad rap for that, but it is, I think, targeted a little bit maybe more towards women readers.
Okay. Another question, was there a relationship between the books being published in the 1930s and how the Great Depression was affecting the world at that time?
I don't like what I'm not really
Maybe
sure. Like,
escapism. I'm not sure.
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting way to think about it. I mean, I would say actually, I would go back a little bit earlier and say that the First World War had more to do with the rise of the ghost story, because there definitely was a resurgence. That's one of the things I wanted to focus on a little bit more today. There was a resurgence in the 20s. So I think after the First World War, that had a lot of difference. And then you know, after that, and in a lot of these stories, you see women and men dealing with the war, you know, through the ghost story. So it's sort of one way to talk about trauma in the form of a ghost, and you know, something that you try to repress and it always comes back, you know, to haunt you. So you have shell shock and, you know, things like that being dealt with in the ghost story. And the same thing, maybe not to such a great extent, but you also had people dealing with World War II in ghost stories as well.
Okay, that's interesting.
Mhm.
And I had this question as well. How did you get interested in this genre?
Oh, this is something I was just talking about it earlier this week. We had the launch for Women's Weird 2, and um, I was thinking about it, and it's hard to believe I've been working on this for almost 20 years now. So I got started on it with my PhD program, and you know, it was sort of surprising to me to think that you know, not a lot had been written on women and their, you know, their involvement in the ghost story genre. So that's where I got started. And then my book collecting. So I guess I'm a, you know, I'm not a professional curator for this series. I'm more of an amateur curator. My rare book collecting came from the fact that in order to write about these stories, a lot of times I had to buy the book to get the story, to write about the story, or to be able to reprint the story. So a lot of times there was like one or two copies out there, and I had to get the book in order to be able to, you know, research it and talk about it more. So that's really where my bad book collecting happened, you know, got started. My bank account doesn't thank me for that, but yes, I mean, a lot of these copies, they're like those two paperbacks of Marjorie Lawrence that I showed, with the big brown table, and the other one, I haven't, ever since I got those, I haven't seen any other copies come up for sale. So I'm really thankful. Those are two of my kind of my prized possessions.
Yeah, I enjoyed seeing how the covers changed with different publications of the same book. That was interesting how you shared that.
I love looking at that, like through the decades, right? You
Yeah,
see how the styles can change. Yeah.
yeah, it was that was great. One more question: as far as the protagonists in these books, do these female writers use more heroines, heroes, or a mix?
There's really a mix. It's interesting. That's an interesting question. A lot of times these women will use male narrators. So it'll be, you know, written, it's really interesting layers. It's written by a woman, you know, being told through the viewpoint of a man. So a lot of times too, if you had a woman maybe that was using initials or writing under a male pseudonym, for many years, a lot of these women were not identified as, you know, female writers.
Mhm.
But you do see them definitely, which I guess would make sense more so than male writers, using more women characters as central characters. For a good example would be that the cover of Terraces of Night that I showed, and it had that woman, you know, on the cover. And she ends up, again, I don't want to give too much away if you want to find that story, but she ends up being the heroine of the story and really saving her fiance. So a lot of times you have even women who come back from beyond the grave, and they were victimized as a living woman, and they come back empowered, and you know, they can kind of incite this fear. So yeah, so you have a lot more of that going on with female writers.
Okay. Well, those are all the questions. I'll give people a few more minutes to pop one in if they have one final question. But like all of the programs we've had, it's just so interesting to see this little niche thing that maybe none of us knew about. And we appreciate you sharing your time with that. We do have another question that popped in. That copy of Too Hot for Hell looks like some of the old Argosy magazines I used to see in barbershops when I was a kid. Is it the same artist? Do you know?
I don't know, and I can't go back. There's actually, I have to look and see. There's an artist on that cover, and I haven't been able to make out the name. But I'll go back and look and see if I can find the match for that. But I don't know. I don't. That's a good question.
Yeah,
But I know the Argosy magazines. Yeah, the style is very much the same. And Weird Tales and things like that. Weird Tales magazine, yeah.
There's a new research topic for you. So, well, this has been great, and we really appreciate you spending time with us today and sharing your interest in these topics with all of us. I want to give y'all a little preview for next week, and our guest is going to be Dr. Carolyn Day, who is an associate professor of history at Furman. And I found this very interesting too. Her title is Dying to be Beautiful, the Case of the 1840s. Apparently in the 1840s, women dressed and wore makeup to look like they had tuberculosis. That was the style. So we're going to learn about that. And just as an interesting point of fact for those of you who are OLLI members at Furman, one of our student workers, Logan Bogus, did research with Dr. Day a couple of summers ago. So we sort of knew about this. So we're interested in hearing more about it. So we hope to see you next week for that, and are glad that everyone joined us today. I know that we have some of our excuse me, I'm trying to do two things at one time. Some of our guests today are members of other OLLIs, and we are glad to have you all with us as well. I know our Penn State friends are here. And if you're here from another OLLI, if you would send me a note in the chat just to let me know, I love to know who all is here with us. So, but with that, we are finished. And if anyone has, yeah, I'm seeing applause for Melissa. So thank you very much, Melissa. And we are glad you are here with us. We hope that you all will join us next week. And then one final week on November 13th, we end where we started with Jeff McCullough and another interesting topic from him. So I hope you all have a great weekend, and that you aren't having to spend too much time cleaning up your yards after yesterday's storm. Or if you have plenty of time, you can come help clean up my yard because it's kind of a mess. And if anybody has any questions for me, I'm glad to answer them. But otherwise, we will see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Did anyone else make a hanky-panky?
Yes.
More
or less.
Great. I had a glass of wine and it's gone, so.
Yep, we're done.
We had
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Sue. It's good to see you.
Sorry, I was a minute late.
Oh, and Jeff, we have a request to keep this series going. We'll have to discuss that.
We'll talk more.
Okay. Oh,